gospel.
There's no power in there.
We're going to keep going.
The gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said again, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on God's people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I wish we knew this widow's name. That way we could give her a little more humanity. But the writer of Luke left that out. He forgot it, and he all but forgot her. That's not hard to imagine. I mean, after all, she has nothing anymore. Her son just died. Literally, just died. Jewish custom was to remove the body from the town within the day. It makes sense. I mean, there were no fancy and involved embalming techniques in the first century. Nothing to keep the body around to look at, to mourn over, to grieve with. She was on the way out with him so that she would be able to fulfill the customs of the day, and because she had no way to preserve him at all. He was gone, and soon would be returned to the dust. This woman felt that dust settling around her as she walked toward the gates, the dust of wondering where her next meal would come from. After all, a widow was not the most financially stable person in the first century. She no longer had someone to support her, no one to pay the bills, no one to buy the food. She no longer had someone to support her basic needs. Finances, of course, were a big worry for her. They are for most people. But she had other dusts settling into those cracks in her new life. The dusty feeling of aloneness would begin to creep in after the shock of the loss left. Not only was she widowed and feeling lonely, but she now found herself without a son, her only related companion left. Her immediate family was dissolved, destroyed, and broken. She was going to go back to a house and life without anyone. What a lonely house that would be, gathering dust, gritty, powdery dust. What a lonely woman she has become because her last personal relationship was taken away from her prematurely. She has become lifeless. Dust has started to settle on her heart, and uncertainty has taken over. My sister-in-law just gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. She and my brother spent months preparing for her arrival and had made her part of the family before she was even born. She had been woven into the fabrics of their lives. But she was born with some pretty serious heart problems, and immediately after delivery, she was rushed to the NICU where the doctors and nurses could take care of her. That strand that Kaylee took up in the tapestry of my brother's and sister's life had been pulled out. It was empty. It was a very dusty moment for my sister-in-law, especially. She couldn't even see Kaylee for 3 days after she was born. The dust started to settle in her heart because someone she loved was not there. She's since been able to see and hold Kaylee, but the nursery in their house is still gathering dust for now. It's a lonely room, a room of an uncertain future, a room of loneliness and of dust. These dusty rooms and dusty houses and uncertain futures seem to be more the norm than the exception these days. With government shutdowns always being threatened, with budgets tightening across the board, everyone is feeling the tightening of the belt. Some are even wondering where their next meal will come from. Unfortunately, many people are walking in shock toward their own personal city gates, full of shock and full of bewilderment. The widow at Nain felt these realities of lost stability and lost relationship. She knew that it would be easy to be forgotten about. She probably wouldn't be surprised to learn that Luke didn't mention her name or anything about her. Life looked pretty bleak for this woman. So on one side of this gate, we have bleakness, we have shock, we have uncertainty. On one side of this gate, we have the dust beginning to settle, dust beginning to form. On the other side of the gate, however, is Jesus. He's followed, like the woman, by a large crowd. However, instead of professional mourners, amateur mourners, and the like, he was followed by a jubilant group of people. After all, everyone is in high spirits. He had just healed the centurion's slave. He had just shown the crowd that he was able to do God's saving work in the world. They, of course, would be ecstatic. Jesus just performed a miracle. And I'm talking about a true miracle, not those temple magicians who just did silly illusions. Jesus was not the David Blaine of his time doing magic tricks to win people's attention and awe. He did not create elaborate illusions which left people wondering if what they saw was real or not. He actually healed a slave. People were able to see him and talk to him. They were rejoicing because they no longer had to deal with the illusions people played. So this crowd was rejoicing in life and overflowing with joy and happiness. I remember 2 Januaries ago, my friend was ordained. His ordination had a procession with about 20 people in it, from a book bearer to a crucifer. He had an incense bowl and a liturgical dancer and banners with bells, and he pulled out all the stops. His ordination was a celebration of the life and the energy of the Church Universal, that Christ is working and alive in all of us and in the institution. The people in that procession remind me of Jesus' followers, expectant, excited, and enthusiastic about the future. It was emotional, it was joyful, it was festive. And like that crowd, we see that Jesus was finally the one to fulfill God's promise of life and restoration to all. But then he runs into the funeral procession. I can only imagine what that was like, the collision of excitement and of shock, of joy and of pain, of ecstatic shouts and whistles, and of tears and wailing, the electric energy of new life, and the feeling of emptiness of death. It's not always easy to imagine what crowds looked like in Jesus' time. We're so far removed, but I wonder what it would be like today if a church scheduled a funeral and a baptism on the same day. What would it look like to see a casket coming out of a church while people dressed in white ready to celebrate the entrance of one of God's children into the community of Christ were going in? What a juxtaposition. These two opposites colliding, and frankly, a surprise if you've ever seen one. And yet this is precisely what happens. These two incompatible groups of people surprise each other. This woman, on her way out, literally and figuratively, to the margins of town, is met by people so excited about what Jesus has done that they can hardly wait to enter the town and tell people. And then Jesus does something even more unexpected. Do not weep. Really, now, this is the part of the story where I personally get angry at Jesus. I mean, who in their right mind tells a widow not to weep? Maybe my romanticized view of Jesus isn't right. Maybe Jesus is actually cold-hearted, or at the very, very least, a bad pastoral caregiver. I mean, in CPE this summer, we were told never to tell people to not cry and never to offer them tissues because that would create the assumption that crying was bad. But Jesus never heard this advice. Do not weep. Wow. It's kind of out of left field. But I don't think it is, because just as Jesus is telling this woman not to weep, he's walking toward the casket and he touches it and tells the boy to raise. Jesus knew what he was doing. He knew that the woman had absolutely no reason to weep because she would experience joy beyond imagination. He was telling her that her fears of being alone and of being unable to support herself were unnecessary. To the widow, these words probably came out of shock. I can imagine her mind racing with thoughts of, how dare you tell me that? Can't you see my son just died? Can't you see I'll be forgotten? Then the widow's surprise became even more intense because she saw before her eyes her dead son listening to the rabbi. I've never seen anyone raised from the dead. I can imagine the surprise I would feel if I saw it, though. Now, Jesus tells this woman who had nothing since her son was dead to not weep. And then he raises her son from the dead. He restores her relationships. He restores her hope. And she doesn't expect it. The crowd following her doesn't expect it. And they, in awe, realize he's a prophet. And they tell their friends, who tell their friends, who tell a few more people, until all of a sudden all of Judea knows. Jesus meets this woman in a shocking way. And he turns her funeral dirge into a tango. These miracle stories are great, They're wonderful examples of how Jesus was able to make anything possible, to do the unexpected, to heal, to bring life, and to bring wholeness to people. And the great thing is that today Jesus still meets us in unexpected places. This woman's last thought on earth was that she was going to meet a person that could restore her to happiness and wholeness. And yet, like he met her, Jesus meets us in the most unexpected of places. A few years ago, I was a church camp counselor in Ohio, and the ELCA's program theme for that summer was Jesus Meets Us. There were great themes like Jesus meets us in the neighbor, Jesus meets us at the table, and then Jesus meets us in La Frontera. Yeah, explain that to a kindergartner. I wish I had known then what I know now. La Frontera, the wilderness place. Jesus meets us in the places we don't expect him. He comes to our wilderness moments in the times and places where we least expect him, in the times we are marching out of our own gates, the places where that dust is settling into our own lives, in La Frontera. Jesus comes to us to raise the dead places that have our focus, the places that are in shock for us. And Jesus promises to meet us there, to surprise us when we feel like all hope is lost because someone, something, or some idea has died in our own lives. Because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, because he took the time to do the unexpected for the widow at Nain, we too can look to the resurrection of the dead, fearful, and dusty places in our own lives. Those dead places will become alive. The fearful places will become purely hope, and the dust that settles will be blown away in the places and at the times when we least expect it. Because Christ comes to us not on our schedule, but on his, with words of, "Do not weep. And I say to you, rise." Jesus is coming, and thanks be to God for the surprise of the life-giving Christ. Amen.
Amen.